Howdy folks, Greyhawk4x4 coming at you again, your resident vintage gamer, and it is Beer 30. As you can tell by my authentic German Hefeweizen here, and as you can see, it's nice and cloudy because, of course, that's an unfiltered beer. Cheers. Oh man. Ooh. Today's selection, Franziskaner Weissbier. It is a Hefeweizen, but it says so on the back. On the front it says Premium Weissbier, and this is imported, of course. And it says they have been brewing this in Munich, Germany, since 1363. So, I thought that would be an appropriate beer for today's story time. Because that's how I'm going to do these. I'm going to do a Beer 30, and I'm just going to do a story time video. Kind of mash them up together there. Especially when they kind of coincide. So, the reason that I picked this one today is that the very first beer that I got when I was in Germany in 1987... I went into a bar and I got a Hefeweizen. Never had heard of one before, had no idea what the hell it was. And they put one of these things in front of me, and it was draft. And they put one of these in front of me, and it was all cloudy and stuff. Never seen a cloudy beer before. All the beer I've ever had was clear, see-through, you know. And it had a slice of lemon floating on the top. And I'm like, what the hell is this? And then I tried it. And this amazing, combination of, the one that one I got, that first one I got, the first thing that I remember was getting hints of banana for some reason, that it tasted like, and this one's a little bit like that, but it was like, damn, what the heck is that delicious banana taste or whatever, and I don't know if it's the hops, the yeast, the combination. I don't think, they don't put banana in it, because it's brewed with the Reinheitsgebot, which means there's only 3 ingredients that can go into beer. But regardless, that's what it tastes, and it was very refreshing. God, you're thirsty, hot, and everything. Oh my God. And so that was my first time I'd really had good beer. I mean, I was in the States, in the Army. You're not even 21, but you can go out. If you're in the military and you're in a military town, you can go out and you pretty much drink anywhere. At least back then you could. Even if you weren't 21, it didn't matter. And, of course, everything I'm drinking is Stroh's and Budweiser and Michelob and stuff like that. And then I get to Germany, and there's the good stuff, right? So, anyway, that's why I picked that beer today. And today is the anniversary of D-Day, 75th anniversary of D-Day. The Allied amphibious landing in Normandy, which was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, the Germans in World War II. And how this all ties together here is that they landed D-Day. That was the beginning of the end. Then they pushed forward. The Russians were pushing forward, and it ended up culminating in the downfall of the Third Reich and the end of the war in Europe. And then Japan, of course, all that came later. But it was the end of the war in Europe. Victory in Europe, the whole bit. So then, of course, the end of the World War II was once Japan was once we defeated Japan. Then it was the end of the World War II. But after that, of course, they started divvying up the spoils. And the Russians wanted, part of Germany. And we wanted to protect, we didn't want Germany, but, for ourselves, but we wanted to protect it for the German people. And so they agreed that they created East Germany and West Germany, and then Berlin in East Germany would be split. There'd be two parts, an east and a west, in Berlin. And so the Berlin Wall was created, and the Cold War started because the Russians were pissed off at us, we didn't trust the Russians, and so forth. And as a result, because of this whole dichotomy, everything that was going on with Berlin and the Berlin Wall and all that, we kept a presence for 40 years in Germany. And when I say a presence, I mean U.S. troops all throughout Germany. And NATO, I should say NATO troops. There was British troops, there were French troops, all throughout Germany. And we were prepared if the Russians ever decided that, screw it, we're going to take Germany for ourselves, and would have tried to invade. That's why we were there, was to deter that invasion. And I was part of the Lance missile. I was what they called a Lance missile crew member, and we had a missile system that we had deployed there. We had 6 different units throughout Germany with these missiles, and they had 2 different kinds of warheads. They had a regular warhead, which was high explosive, and then they had a nuclear warhead. And that was the deterrent. Along with Pershing missiles, there were Pershing missiles that were bigger missiles that could go longer distances and so forth. And then, of course, there was other field artillery and so forth. And that was the deterrent. Now, at the end of World War II, there was a guy named Wernher von Braun. And he was the guy who created the first rocket for the Germans. I think it was called the V2 rocket, that they were using during World War II that was devastating. And it was kind of like if you knew what the Scud missile was that was used by Iraq back in the Desert Storm days. It was basically kind of like that, but the first version of that. And so he designed that, but at the end of World War II, he defected to the U.S. And they created it was right about the time that in the 60s when Kennedy said, hey, we're going to go to the moon. And so they took von Braun and said, hey, can you help us get to the moon? You come up with an idea for rockets that'll get us to the moon and all that. But at the same time, they were also using him to come up with ideas for offensive weapons, like the V2 rocket, but better versions of that. And there's a place called White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. And they created his test facility there, where he started testing all these different rockets and missiles and so forth. Well, my missile system would not have existed had it not for von Braun. He was the one, his research and all the stuff he did led to there was the Honest John missile and the Sergeant missile and all those that were the precursors to the Lance missile system, my system, and Pershings. And, but it all basically started, von Braun was the reason that all that research was getting done. And, how ironic, because here's the guy that was fighting against us in World War II, and now he's helping us, and now we're using that very technology to deter the Russians from invading Germany. So fast forward to when I was in Germany, 87 to 90, and the Cold War was still going. And so, a lot of people don't understand what that all meant. They just hear the Cold War, that, okay, yeah, we didn't like the Russians didn't like us, etc. But there was a lot of bullshit going on. There was, if you saw the Americans, that was what happened here, but what was happening in Germany was even worse, as far as the spying and the subterfuge and all that stuff. And so we're a deterrent, but we're also having to be on guard at all times, because the spying thing was a real deal. You always had to be on the lookout for people that could be trying to compromise you. Because think about it, I worked in a nuclear missile system. It's like, yeah, would they want to compromise me? You bet your ass they would. Would they want to compromise, anybody else that was in my unit? Of course they would, And So we went through all kinds of training about that, anti-terrorist training and counterintelligence, training, and we went through electronic warfare training, counter, what was it called? It was called, I can't think of the name of it right now, but there was like ECCM. It was like electronic countermeasures, and all this stuff we had to go through. And one of the things was, this is called a smell 'em card. See if I can get that so you guys can see that. Now, this is not something that is like classified or anything like that. This was what, and you can Google these. I mean, you can pull this right up on Google if you want to. But this is my real one. This is the actual one they used to give us. And I've kept it, of course, all these years. And it gives you instructions in here what you do if this was what you're seeing there is a Russian license plate for the Soviet military liaison mission. And what these guys were basically, they were spies, but they put this stuff on their cars and they said, hey, we're, you know the old story from the first Star Wars, ambassadors on a diplomatic mission. Right? So, but they weren't. They were spies. And what they would do is they would use this basically to get through and drive through the country. They were allowed to drive on the autobahns. They weren't allowed to stop. That's the funny part. They had to make sure they gassed up because they weren't supposed to stop. They could drive on the autobahns. They couldn't get off the autobahns onto the city streets. They couldn't stop. But they could get through Germany, through West Germany if they needed to, and so forth. And in here are the instructions for what we were supposed to do if we saw one of these vehicles, including blocking them in and all this. Now, here's the kicker. A lot of the times we weren't armed. If we're just tooling around in a Jeep before we got the Humvees, and we eventually got the Humvees, but we're tooling around, whatever, doing errands or whatever, and we see one of these, we're not necessarily armed all the time. We're supposed to just block these guys in, and then there's no cell phones. This is before cell phones. So, I mean, there was like some people the rich people had car phones, but we didn't have them in military vehicles. If you were lucky, you had a radio. But most of the time, you didn't have any communication in the vehicle. So you're like, you got to get to some kind of telephone to try and call the MPs to say, hey, we just stopped a smell 'em vehicle. Luckily, I never saw one. Never had to detain one. But that was a real deal. I mean, that did happen all the time where U.S. service personnel, like if they got off the Autobahn and you saw them, you were obliged to stop them and detain them and call the MPs and so forth. If you saw them stopped on the Autobahn, same thing. So that was all going on. Then you, of course, had to be aware of anybody taking notes or making little sketches, like where our equipment and everything was. It was fenced, but you could see some of it, and if you're just driving along and you see some guy just standing there making notes or something, you were obliged to stop this guy and call the MPs or whatever to find out what they're doing and so forth. And there was terrorist attacks that were happening all the time. There was a bombing in Frankfurt that killed some U.S. Service people. There was the head of the Deutsche Bank was killed by the Red Army faction. If you ever want to Google that, that's a fascinating story how they did that. That was crazy. They blew him up in his car in the middle of the road. Just Google like head of Deutsche Bank terrorist attack, and you'll find it. His last name was like Herrhausen or something like that. Something like that. Anyway, but that stuff was all happening all the time, and word of that wasn't getting back to the States. People weren't hearing about that kind of stuff. So then, fast forward a little bit further, and in 1990, or actually it was the end of 89, it was like November 6th of 89, the Berlin Wall falls. And it was a few days after that I'm on guard duty at one of the gates at our caserne with another guy, and it was in the middle of the night. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that. And there wasn't a lot of traffic, obviously, because of the time. And we're sitting there BSing, looking out for stuff. And here comes this little car, and it's a weird-looking car. And we're looking at it, and we're like, I've never seen something like that. That's a strange-looking car. Well, it turned out, we figured it out afterwards, it was what they call a Trabant. And the Trabant is a car, you can Google that as well, that was the East German car. That was the one that was all they had. I mean, you could get a Trabant, or you could also get a Trabant. I mean, that was it. And they're a weird-looking small little sedan, and so you're definitely recognizable when you see one. You know it's something odd. And it had a weird license plate, and as it was driving by us, that was when it struck us. When we saw that license plate, we're like, that's not a German license plate. Well, it was an East German license plate, and we'd never seen one before because they weren't allowed to come into West Germany up until that point. But the wall had fallen, and where we are seeing people that probably could never have done that, here they come right through Aschaffenburg where I was stationed. And it was kind of a weird, it was one of those like, whoa, we just saw some East Germans come through here. The wall's down. It's happening. And then, I think it was the very next week, we got in formation. Our lieutenants had us in formation, and they pulled out a duffel bag, and out of the duffel bag, they pulled this big giant rock. They had gone to Berlin over the weekend, and they got a giant section of the Berlin Wall. I would say giant, but I mean it was big enough to fill a duffel bag. And one of them lifted it up and smashed it on the ground right there in front of all of us. And then they told us, fall out, grab a piece of history, fellas. And there's my piece of history. It's got just a little bit of graffiti you can see on that little pink graffiti there. If I can, right there. See if I can, right there. A little bit of rust and stuff. But that's it. That's a real piece of the Berlin Wall that I picked up off the motor pool after our lieutenants smashed it and gave us all a piece. And I've had it ever since. So then, in May of 1990, I get out of the Army. I leave Germany, come back, and I'm out of the Army. And then fast forward a little bit more, and they start pulling a lot of the troops out, because the Cold War is over now. They start pulling everybody out, and the caserne where we were, Fiore Caserne, gets turned into apartments. Like the Germans just turn it back into apartments or whatever. But there's a plaque, and maybe I'll tweet out or put it on Facebook, a picture of it, but there's a plaque now on the Fiore at the front gate that says, thank you to our American partners for 40 years of peace, blah, blah, defenders of the peace and all that. And it's dedicated to all of us that served in the Cold War in Aschaffenburg, Germany. It's pretty cool. So it all comes together. D-Day, end of the war. Von Braun, he defects. Then he starts working on missile systems and everything else for us. My missile system is created along with Pershing and all the others. We're the deterrent. We're there long enough to finally beat down the Russians and say, tear down this wall. And they finally do. And I get a chunk of it. And then there's a plaque up saying, thanks guys, you did a great job. Appreciate all the help. But it all started with D-Day. If we weren't successful at D-Day, none of that would happen. Who knows where we'd be, how things would be. It all started with D-Day. Anyway, guys, that is my story time. I don't know if it was entertaining, but it is what it was. That was my time in Germany, so. You guys said you wanted the beer 30s and story times. You got both. So I may put a poll up later and say, how often you guys want me to do one of these, whatnot. But like I said, I'm just going to keep cranking out videos. and we'll figure out different things to talk about. I just put one up today about Baldur's Gate 3, the announcement for that. I already have an idea for a video tomorrow, and we'll just remember the acronym. See how many of you guys are watching all the way to the end for tomorrow's video. Acronym PIIG, 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 pig. That acronym is going to mean something tomorrow. All right, we'll talk to you guys. We'll catch you guys on the flip side. How about that?